Welcome to a novel talk. I'm Wendy Kendall, a cozy mystery author and middle grade mystery writer, and half of the duo bringing you our regular podcast series, talking with fascinating novelists writing across a variety of genres. And here is your co-host.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm Carl Lee, and I write paranormal fantasy, and I can hardly wait to meet our guest, Wendy. But first, I want to congratulate you on signing your first publishing contract. We at A Novel Talk are all very proud of you.
Thanks, Carl. Well, this episode is a thriller because Robert Dugoni is joining us. Critically acclaimed author, New York Times bestseller, #1 Wall Street Journal, #1 Amazon best-selling author of the Tracy Crosswhite series. These have sold over 2 million copies, and it's been optioned for television series development, but that's not all. There's also the best-selling David Sloan series, and even more standalone books, including the original The Cyanide Canary, a Washington Post Best Book of the Year. Along with multiple awards and award nominations, Robert Dugoni books are sold worldwide and translated into more than 24 languages. With all this work, it's amazing how much time Robert Dugoni gives back to the writing community through classes, workshops, and speaking engagements. His latest exciting book is The Eighth Sister, featuring his character Charles Jenkins from the David Sloan series in a truly action thriller, much of it set in Russia. So, a Russian-American Dobro Pojalovit. That is to say, welcome to A Novel Talk, Robert Dugoni.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
With The Eighth Sister, I feel like I've truly experienced Russia. Can you talk about the research you did for this book?
Sure. First and foremost, I had a chance to go to Russia back in 99. And, I never thought I'd be necessarily writing a book about Moscow or St. Petersburg or any of the places in Russia, but it was just a fascinating country. I mean, from the moment I got there, it was, shortly after the fall of communism, and they were still trying to figure out capitalism. We had a number of odd and funny and, somewhat scary things happen to us while we were over there. And all of it just made for probably the most intriguing trip I've ever been on. And I've traveled quite a bit. But there was just something about that country that was almost surreal. It was almost unreal that things were the way they were there. And I think that people that have traveled there know what I'm talking about, especially at that time in history. So I spent a lot of times at a lot of the locations that are in the book, the hotels, some of the other places as well. And then what I didn't know, I got the old-fashioned way. I spoke to several people that had worked in Moscow. I spoke to a guy that worked for a State Department that I can't really name, that spent a lot of his time over there in the late 1970s. I spoke to other people that had worked over there in the oil and gas industry. And what I still couldn't figure out, I resorted to the writer's, old standby, which was Google Earth and other places as well, and tried to fill in the blanks.
Well, you certainly did. It's all so vivid. I really enjoyed that dimension of the setting.
Yeah, I agree. It felt like taking a trip to Russia. I've traveled a number of places, but I've never gone to Russia. One of the themes in the book appears to be the ideal that one person, one man, can make a difference. Was that one of the driving points behind this story? Were you trying to bring that point home?
Not necessarily. I think that is definitely something that can be taken out of the narrative. and I can see how that would readers would come to that conclusion. I really wanted to take an individual who was desperate because of his circumstances, and who acts out of love for his family, and finds himself completely and totally betrayed. I wanted to create a situation that was, believable, that people would understand why a man like this would do what he did, and that was a big part of making the book work. I think all of us writers know that if you don't have a strong motivation for your protagonist, and you give the reader any chance to say, I don't believe this, you're going to lose them. And so first and foremost, I needed to have a reason why a disgruntled former CIA officer would go back. And so really what I was trying to develop was more of an everyman, an everyman who finds himself in suddenly thrust into a situation where he has to react, he has to rely on what skills he has to keep himself alive. And I think all of us find ourselves at various points in our life, not necessarily in a life or death situation with another country chasing us, but certainly, in situations where we didn't expect to have happen what happened, and we had to react, we had to respond. And really the human condition is one that I think people will do amazing things to save their family, to get home to their family, to be with their family. And that's really more what I was trying to get across, is that when you're pushed into a corner and you have no way out except to fight, you'll fight.
Yes, and that point was driven home very clearly as well during the book. It was well done.
Thank you.
Your spy characters are so incredibly good at espionage. How did you learn so many tricks of the trade?
I asked a lot of questions of a lot of people that I can't name. I was very fortunate to have an individual get a hold of me and tell me that he thought he had a story that I would want to tell. And most of us writers know that that's usually the kiss of death. You're never going to return that phone call. But the short of a long story is, I eventually decided to meet with the individual, and we spoke. And while his particular circumstances had absolutely nothing to do with Moscow and Russia, he did know a lot of espionage tricks of the trade. I ran into another individual at a class I was teaching in Houston, and he too knew a lot of the tricks of the trade. I gave a speech at a library here in Seattle, and a gentleman came with his daughter because she had turned him on to my books, and he loved my books, and we started talking, and suddenly I realized that I was talking to a former CIA officer, and he again said that he would be more than willing to help me, and that he had in fact worked in Moscow and in Russia, and he could tell me a little bit about the sort of where the mindset was for Russian agents and for American agents, etc. And so all these guys were really, really wonderful and generous with their time and with the information, and all they asked is that I don't put them in the book or acknowledge them.
Well, I know I certainly learned a lot. I was very impressed.
A lot of it is really interesting. A lot of it isn't the cloak and dagger stuff that I think we're all led to believe. One of the things that really was driven home to me when I was talking to these individuals is, the guy that was in Moscow said to me that all the KGB agents knew all of the CIA officers, and all the CIA officers knew all the KGB agents. The trick wasn't getting to know who was who. The trick was getting away from the people who knew who you were. And so you had guys that would do things like lay down in the back seat of the car, have their wife pull out of the driveway and drive as if going to the supermarket. They'd be followed, and she'd make a sharp turn, and as soon as she made a turn, the guy would roll out the back of the car behind a hedge, wait for the cars to pass, then get up and go the opposite direction, which is not is not real, intriguing spy stuff that you see on James Bond, but just more down and dirty stuff that they just were constantly trying to get away from tales so that they could do what they needed to do.
It's so interesting too. That really captured me.
Yeah, all that spycraft, lightly sprinkled. That's something I also liked, was it was a light sprinkle of spycraft. It wasn't like a heavy James Bond type spy novel. Robert, when the chips are down, if you're lucky, you learn who your true friends are. What kind of true friends do you create for a strong protagonist like Jenkins? And how do you showcase that friendship?
Yeah, that was one of the tricks, because Jenkins had been a loner. He'd been a loner much of his life, and he had walked away from a situation because he didn't trust the people that were supposedly taking care of him. And so, he's also an individual though that has a strong ability to read people and read their motivations and know whether or not what they're saying and doing is honest and true. And so, really what he was doing over there was he was relying on himself, and the people that sort of fell into his pocket, if you will, people that he had to rely on in order to stay alive. They were people not necessarily that he got help from the United States, but just were people that surfaced in his efforts to just stay alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I really wanted to create a scenario where this individual is on his own. The United States government is not going to acknowledge him. The CIA is not going to acknowledge him. They're not going to assist him. And one of the things that these guys told me is that in large part was true. And you knew that when you were going off on a mission. You knew that if something happened to you, if you were captured, they were not going to acknowledge that you were a CIA officer. They were not going to acknowledge that you were on a mission. They would, try to negotiate getting you back, and that usually involved trades. But you were going to spend some time without anybody coming to your assistance.
Could you tell us a little bit about your character, Victor Fedorov? An FSB agent, he's very smart, multidimensional, ruthless, and very good at his job. He is the challenging opponent trying to thwart your protagonist, Charles Jenkins. What would you say is a weakness he has, and is he self-aware enough to try to compensate for it?
Victor Fedorov's weakness is that he likes Charles Jenkins. He respects Charles Jenkins. This is a guy that, in many respects, is the anti-Charles Jenkins, because while Jenkins is a good family man, has a good wife, has kids that love him, Fedorov is a guy whose marriage has failed and whose two daughters don't want to spend any time with him because he's devoted his entire life to his job at the expense of his family. And so he has great respect for Charles Jenkins very early on in the book. And that respect is something that, he has to be careful that he doesn't give Jenkins too much credit or too much respect, because he's got a job to do, and that job is to bring him in. And one of the things I wanted to do, one of the things I wanted to create, was I wanted to create a very real scenario that, these guys have the exact same problems that all the rest of us have. And so, in the midst of this, what he thinks is this, he's going to turn Charles Jenkins into an agent, that's going to give information to the Soviet Union. He's doing it at a play in which his daughter is at the play because he's the bad parent and he promised her he would go to the play. So he's at the play and he's still trying to, to find out whether Jenkins is playing them or whether he's being honest when he says he has information he wants to exchange for money. And that's really what I wanted to get across. I wanted to get across a guy that, was doing his job. And everybody, I think, because of maybe television or what we read in the newspapers, or because of the way Vladimir Putin, conducts himself, we think of the Russians. It used to be this way back in the Olympics. Remember back in the 70s and 80s, before you had perestroika and all those things. I mean, we used to think that the Russians were a different type of human. We used to think that they were the big bad steroid guys, and they were like these autotrons, these robots. And I think too often that's how they're portrayed. And in reality, they're people like us. And so these CIA agents, they go home at night to somebody, to someone, to something. And I really wanted to create a scenario in which you're dealing with real human beings that are trying to do their job.
Yeah, it's so well done in the book. You really get that multidimensional factor.
Well, Fedorov was such a great character, and he was so well received that he's a big part of the sequel that I'm writing now. And I'm in the process of the developmental edits. And everybody who's read the book says the same thing. I love Fedorov. I was just at the Pacific Northwest Writers Association conference, and I brought up The Eighth Sister as an example of something that I was teaching. And the woman sitting in the front row goes, "I loved Fedorov."
I'm excited to hear that he's in the sequel. That's awesome, because I also enjoyed that character.
Yeah, and I mean, and to think that the woman was telling me that she loved the antagonist. I think that's what all of us mystery thriller writers, are shooting for, is an antagonist that's just as well-rounded, just as interesting as your protagonist. And I don't write the vampire books. I don't write the books where the protagonist is this person that drinks blood and eats human flesh and is I don't do that. I think a lot of times the villain is simply the person who wants exactly the opposite of what the protagonist wants, and is trying to do their job to prevent the protagonist from getting what the protagonist wants. But they're not necessarily evil people.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. The way you manage to have that balance in several of your books that I've read. As a writer of thrillers, you must have something of a magician's eye for misdirection. There's the scene surrounding the airport at Chinos. Specifically, you led me down the wrong trail for several pages. When you're setting up this sort of misdirection, do you start with the outcome and work backwards, or do you work with the misdirection moving and then make sure that it's resolved the way you want to in a forward motion?
Misdirection, misinformation is a very big part of espionage. What I was told by these individuals is, one of the best ways to get someone off your tail, to keep them from following you, et cetera, is to continually put out misinformation and things like that. So I really stayed with the protagonist in the present and just sort of worked my way through it. Now, that's not to say that once the draft was done, I didn't go back and massage it here and there or whatever. But when I'm writing, I really try to stay in whatever character's point of view I'm in the book. I try to stay in their point of view, and I try to think as they would think, and I try to respond as they would respond. Now, obviously, there were many situations in that novel and in the novel I'm writing now where they are playing a game of chess, and so when one guy makes a move, the other has to respond. And in order to respond, he has to anticipate what the move was going to be. And the trick is trying to, the trick for the writer is trying to write in such a way that the reader doesn't anticipate everything that you're doing. Because I think what readers love more than anything is to be uncertain of the outcome, to be tricked, to be surprised. my dad, when I was growing up, would watch a movie on TV, and he would turn and he'd look at me and he'd say, "Have you figured it out? Have you figured it out?" And I'd be like, "Dad, stop! I'm just trying to watch the movie." But that's what readers do, is readers try to figure it out. That's the fun part for them. And so if you're able to fool them, it's not a bad thing. That's what they want. At least my readers, that's what they want. They want to read a book where they're really uncertain what's going to happen.
And you do it beautifully.
Thank you.
This action thriller becomes also a legal thriller. So both sides of this adventure are enthralling. What do you especially like about writing each of these different types in one thriller, and what gave you the idea to have both in one epic novel?
Well, it's never been done that I'm aware of. I mean, I'm sure there are people out there that are far more widely read that I am who will say, no, that's not true. But in my recent experience, and I read a lot, there wasn't. I didn't find anything really seriously like this, and so I wanted to give it a try. The trick, of course, was to not make the break so extreme that it became two different types of novels. And I think to a large extent, I was able to do that. There's been some people that have emailed me or whatever, and said that while they liked the first part of the book, they didn't like the second. There have been people who have said they liked the second part of the book better than they liked the first part of the book. And so I think to some degree that break existed, which I was trying to get away from. It's been something that's been difficult for Hollywood to get their hands around. But I sold The Eighth Sister to a very big producer in LA. They're very excited about it. They want to move forward quickly, getting it turned into a screenplay, and they have a vision on how they're going to handle that. And when we spoke and talked about the vision, it made perfect sense for TV. And that was basically to start with the trial and then tell the rest of the story in sort of flashback as to what happened and how he found himself in a courtroom. And I think that that's great, and it probably would have worked in a novel. But I'm happy with how I wrote the book, and I'm happy with how it turned out. Reading is a different medium than television, and while one thing will work in television, it doesn't necessarily work in a novel, and it's not really what happened. I mean, I really wanted a situation where Charles Jenkins really doesn't realize the extent to which he's been betrayed until he's back on United States soil. I wanted the reader to think he's safe. Okay, he's safe. He's back. He made it. He's safe. What is he going to write about now? How come there's still 100 pages left in this novel? And that's what I wanted. I wanted the reader to have a false sense of security, the same way that Charles Jenkins had a false sense of security.
That is so well done in the book. Our listeners are in for a treat. It's beautifully done, but I'm excited to hear that there's a television deal in the works. Wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, the talk is a series character. So we'll see what happens. I mean, there's a lot that can happen, between now and getting a script written and getting a pilot done and all those things. But I never write a book with that in mind. Obviously, I think it would be great. It's just another medium to see Charles Jenkins come to life, but we'll see what happens.
Exciting. I know it sounds a bit redundant to say a thriller was thrilling, but this one was. You had me holding my breath chapter after chapter. I literally remember vividly throughout reading this entire book, forcing myself to breathe. It's amazing. How do you know, as a thriller writer, when to let off enough gas so that we can catch our breaths?
I think that's a feel thing, to be honest. I don't know that there's a rule for it. I just think it's a feel thing. One of the things is you never want to tease a reader. You can flirt with a reader, and a reader wants to be flirted with, but a reader doesn't want to be teased. And so if you go on too long, the reader's going to start to feel teased. and they're going to get upset, and they're going to either skip ahead, they're going to skip chapters, they're going to go try to find out what's going on, or they're just going to put the book down. So you want to tease the reader, but you don't want to hold them in suspense for too long. I guess suspense not the right word. You want to hold them in suspense, but you don't want to artificially keep answers from them for too long, because, like I said, they're gonna feel like you're toying with them. And the other thing is you want to continue. When one problem gets solved, you want there to be another problem, and when that problem gets solved, you want there to be another problem. So you want to continually move the story forward and move the reader through the various obstacles that the protagonist has to get over in order to fulfill whatever journey he's on.
Your women characters have great strength in their beliefs, and they care very deeply for what they've decided is important. Can you talk especially about creating the spy Paulina?
Yeah, I think women are stronger than men to begin with. I think that's why women have kids. I mean, I don't think any man could ever go through it. And I think women solve problems differently than men. They're not looking to get into a fist fight. They're looking to intellectually outsmart their opponent. At the same time, they can be physically very capable in combat, etc. So I think women spies, women soldiers, women police officers are already interesting because they are not proceeding under the norm. The norm is still, although it's getting better, the norm is still in many respects, that women are not as strong as men emotionally or physically, and women stay home with the children and blah, blah, blah. So I think the minute I create a female homicide detective like Tracy Crosswhite, or I create a female spy like Paulina Ponomanova, I already have created an interesting character because they're stretching limits and they're breaking norms. And what I like to do, what I try to do, is I try to show that those women are capable of stretching those limits and breaking those norms without losing their femininity, without losing what it is that makes them female. They don't have to become men in order to succeed. They can succeed by being a woman, and often they can succeed to a greater extent than a man can by being a woman, being true to who they are.
Charles Jenkins we've known from other books with David Sloan, and here we see him grow yet again as a character and learn things about himself. There are other familiar characters in this book that I felt like you wrote about in a different light than before, as they also grow and evolve within themselves. As an author, what are the advantages and disadvantages of having a series where you get to be with a character for an extended time?
Well, the disadvantage is you create a real conundrum when you sell your stuff to LA. Because there's a real conundrum about what you're selling and who you're selling it to and what they can do and what they can't do with it. I didn't think about any of those things when I wrote this story. All I thought about was the opportunity to bring back some really great characters. And if Charles Jenkins is going to get in trouble, and people have been reading the David Sloan series, they know he's going to turn to David Sloan. If he doesn't turn to David Sloan, they're going to go, what the hell is going on here? So, I had a little bit of a conundrum there, a little bit of a problem. But I didn't think of it that way. I just thought of it as an ability to return to characters that I had truly loved creating, and at points in their lives where things are changing. I mean, Jake is no longer a little boy. He's in finishing law school. He's going to join a law practice. And so, the advantage is that I'm familiar with them. I liked them when I created them. people like them, that people wanted to see them come back. The disadvantage, beyond all the, the LA and multiple publisher issues and problems, the disadvantage is simply that you hope that you don't disappoint the reader in how you're portraying the character in the future. And what I mean by that is, I wrote a literary novel called The Extraordinary Life of Sam Hell. And Sam is probably the most fully developed character that I've ever written, because I go through his life, literally from birth until his mid-40s. And so he's very well known. And, a lot of people love that book and would say to me, have you thought about writing a sequel? And I was sitting one day kind of contemplating it when my son, Joe, said to me, but Dad, if you do that, you're going to take away from the character that already exists. And I looked at him and I thought, wow, you know what, son? You're right. You're absolutely right. So the hard part is sometimes you have to just let characters go away. They've lived their life. They've done what you asked them to do, and it's just time for them to go away. Because if you bring them back, and you risk the possibility of people not liking them. And one of the best examples of that is Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, and then in the sequel, which was I forget what it's called, Go Tell a Guardian or Go Tell somebody. That was sad, because this was probably one of the most iconic characters in American literature, and so many people were so disappointed when he came back as to who he was and what he was.
Well, Robert Dugoni, thank you so much for joining us for a novel talk. Carl and I are just thrilled to have been able to have this opportunity to interview you. And for our listeners, if you want to find out more about our guest, you can go to his website, robertdugonibooks.com.
Yes, Robert, thank you. It was very interesting and informative.
Thank you both. It was a pleasure being on. I appreciate having this time.
Well, to our listeners, you want to run out there and get especially this latest book, The Eighth Sister. It's amazing, but so are the rest of the books that Robert Dugoni's written. And remember to subscribe to our podcast, A Novel Talk, with Carl Lee and Wendy Kendall, so you won't miss an episode. And keep reading, because a novel read leads to a novel talk.